The air at the Miller estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the faint, sad smell of a life being sold off piece by piece. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his faded chambray shirt already showing dark patches of sweat under the arms. He wasn't here for the house or the furniture. He was here for the iron. His eyes scanned the line of machinery, a silent eulogy to old man Miller's 70 years of turning soil. There was a Farmall H, its red paint faded to a dull pink, a John Deere Model A, with its distinctive putt-putt cadence forever silenced, and a few weary-looking hay rakes. Most of it was tired, used up, but Jed's gaze kept drifting past it all to the far end of the line, half hidden behind a collapsing corn crib. It was a monster, an abomination of green steel and rust, bigger than any 2 tractors in the county put together. It sat low and wide, a hulking beast of a machine with 4 massive cracked tires, each one taller than a grown man. It was an early model Steiger, one of the first articulated 4-wheel drives, built up in a barn in Minnesota by farmers who needed more power than anything the big companies were selling. This one had seen better days, decades ago probably. The engine cowling was gone, exposing a colossal diesel engine caked in a solid layer of grease, dirt, and bird droppings. One of the hydraulic cylinders for the steering wept a dark, sticky trail into the dirt. The cab was a simple steel box with shattered windows. A crudely painted sign was wired to the grille, as is. Engine seized. It was scrap, everyone knew it. "Looking at the dinosaur, Jed?" A voice slick with arrogance cut through the auctioneer's drone. Jed didn't have to turn, he knew that voice. Richard Davies, Rich Davies as he liked to be called. Davies had recently taken over his father's farm and was running it on the bank's money, a concept as foreign to Jed as flying to the moon. Davies stepped up beside him, smelling of new car leather and expensive aftershave. He gestured with a soft, uncalloused hand at the derelict Steiger. "They ought to pay someone to haul that thing away. Probably cost more in tires than the whole damn thing is worth." Jed just grunted, his eyes tracing the thick, welded frame of the old tractor. He could see the honest, brutal strength in its design. No frills, no fancy sheet metal, just pure, raw pulling power. "I just signed the papers last week," Davies went on, puffing out his chest. "Brand new John Deere, 4630, sound guard body, air conditioning, AM/FM radio, the works, 150 horse. The banker said it's the finest machine in 3 counties. Said a man's got to spend money to make money." Jed finally turned his head, his gaze flat and hard. "A man's got to pay his debts too." Davies just laughed, a short, barking sound. "That's old-timer talk, Jed. It's called leverage. You use the bank's money to expand, buy the best equipment, farm more land. You can't get ahead turning wrenches on 50-year-old junk." He nodded toward Jed's own farm, a half-mile down the road. "That 4020 of yours is a good tractor, I'll give you that. But it's 20 years old. You're trying to fight a war with a musket while I've got artillery." Jed thought of his John Deere 4020. He'd bought it used but in good shape 10 years prior, and he'd paid the last note on it 5 years ago. Every bolt, every drop of oil in it was his. He knew the sound of its 6-cylinder diesel so well he could tell if the number 3 injector was a little dirty, just by the rhythm of the idle. He knew the exact spot on the clutch you had to feather to get a smooth start with a heavy load. It was an extension of himself. Alongside it in the shed sat his father's old Farmall M, still earning its keep on the hay rake and the planter. They were his. No banker could ever knock on his door and drive them away. The auctioneer was getting closer to the iron row. The crowd shifted. "Well, I'm heading up," Davies said, clapping Jed on the shoulder. "Might pick up that old disc harrow for a few bucks if it goes cheap. Something to tear up until my new offset disc gets delivered. You take care, Jed. Don't waste your money on that green paperweight." Davies swaggered off toward the front of the crowd, the man of the future. Jed stayed where he was, his eyes locked on the Steiger. Scrap, a dinosaur, a paperweight. Maybe they were right. It was a fool's errand. The engine was seized solid. It would take a miracle and a small fortune just to get it to turn over, let alone run. The transmission was a complete unknown, The hydraulics were shot, the wiring was a rat's nest. He'd have to pour weeks, maybe months of his life into it, with no guarantee of success. But Jed saw something else. He saw four-wheel drive traction for the wet spring planting season. He saw the power to pull a 24-foot chisel plow instead of his 12-footer, cutting his fieldwork time in half. He saw a machine built with simple, heavy-duty truck parts, a Cummins engine, a Spicer transmission, Clark axles, things a man could understand, things a man could fix with his own two hands in his own workshop. He saw a way to gain an edge, to increase his own productivity, without signing his name on a banker's dotted line. He saw a path to freedom, disguised as a pile of junk. The auctioneer finally arrived at the Steiger. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this? This yard art? We're selling it for scrap value. Where is? As is. Let's start the bidding at $100. Who'll give me 100? Silence. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Davies, standing near the front, shook his head with a theatrical pity. $100, folks. The tires are probably worth that in scrap rubber. Come on now, give me a bid." Jed took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs. He could feel the weight of every eye in the county on him. He could hear their thoughts, their whispers. Old man Stone thinks he can fix anything. Too stubborn to get with the times, too cheap to buy a real tractor. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever stood at a crossroads like that, where one path is safe and sensible, the one everyone tells you to take, and the other is a risky, lonely gamble that just feels right in your gut? Have you ever seen a man bet his whole future on a pile of rust, trusting his own hands over a banker's promise? Let me know in the comments below, because what Jed did next set the course for the rest of his life. Jed raised a single finger. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got $100 from Jed Stone." "100. Now who'll give 110? 110? The silence was deafening. Davies let out a short, disbelieving laugh. No one else moved. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. "For $100, to the man with more ambition than sense." Jedediah Stone had just bought himself a £30,000 problem. Getting the Steiger home was the first battle in a long war. It took 2 full days, a borrowed lowboy trailer that sagged under the weight, and every chain and come-along Jed owned. He had to use his trusty 4020, its diesel engine barking in protest, to winch the dead giant onto the trailer inch by painful inch. The steel cables groaned, stretching taut as banjo strings, and the whole time Jed could feel the eyes of his neighbors watching from their pickups as they drove by, each one slowing down to get a good look at Jed's folly. He finally got it nestled behind his barn, where it sank into the soft ground, looking even more derelict and hopeless than it had at the auction. His wife, Sarah, came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a strong woman with a quiet faith in her husband that had been tested many times over the years. But as she looked at the mountain of rusting steel, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Jed," she said softly, $100 might not be much. But how much more is this thing going to cost us?" "Just time, Sarah," he said, though he knew it was a lie. "And some sweat. It's got good bones." She just nodded, her gaze lingering on the seized engine. "Well, your supper's getting cold." That winter was a season spent in purgatory. While Rich Davies was attending farm progress shows and taking trips to Florida, Jed was in his unheated workshop, a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, casting long, dancing shadows. The temperature often dropped below zero, and he worked in insulated overalls, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The first order of business was the engine. It was a Cummins, a big inline-six that had probably powered a semi-truck in a former life. Seized. The word meant a dozen different terrible things. Rusted cylinders, a spun bearing that had welded itself to the crankshaft, a thrown rod. He spent a week just trying to get the head off. Every bolt was a battle. He'd soak them in penetrating oil, heat them cherry red with his acetylene torch until they glowed in the dim light, then put a 6-foot cheetah bar on his biggest socket wrench and heave with all his might. More than one bolt sheared off with a sickening crack, which meant hours of patient, painstaking work with a drill and an extractor bit. When the head finally came free, lifted by the straining chains of his engine hoist, the truth was revealed. Water had gotten into two of the cylinders through a rusted-out exhaust pipe. Over the years, it had frozen and thawed, expanded and contracted, and finally cracked the cylinder liners clean through. The pistons were fused to the block with a thick crust of rust. The engine was junk. The talk at the co-op was merciless. "Heard Jed Stone's trying to resurrect that old Steiger," one farmer would say, leaning against a stack of feed bags. "My cousin drove by his place, said he's got the engine torn all to hell. Looks like a bomb went off in his shop." Rich Davies would be there, holding court. "Poor Jed. He just can't accept that the world's moved on. I told him, you can't make money with junk. My new 4630, I plowed 160 acres yesterday and didn't even break a sweat." Listened to the radio the whole time. Jed heard the whispers. He felt the pity and the scorn, but he didn't say a word. He just ordered his parts catalogs and started making calls. He found a salvage yard in Nebraska that had a similar Cummins engine out of a wrecked Kenworth. It cost him nearly $1,000, money from their savings that Sarah had earmarked for new kitchen linoleum. The night he wrote that check, the silence in their little farmhouse was as cold and heavy as the cast-iron engine block sitting in his shop. The salvaged engine was a gamble in itself. It was greasy, grimy, and its history was a mystery. Jed spent the next month tearing it down completely, piece by agonizing piece. He laid every part out on his workbench in perfect order: pistons, connecting rods, bearings, camshaft, valves, springs. He measured everything with his micrometers and calipers, checking for wear against the specifications in the dog-eared service manual he'd sent away for. He replaced the main bearings and the rod bearings. He lapped the valves by hand, the rhythmic grinding of the compound the only sound in the shop for hours on end. He honed the cylinders himself, the smell of cutting oil sharp and clean in the cold air. He worked by a code his father had taught him. If it's worth doing right. No shortcuts. He cleaned every bolt, chased every thread with a tap and die. He scrubbed the engine block in a degreasing tank until the original Cummins beige paint showed through the grime. Slowly, painstakingly, the pile of greasy parts began to resemble an engine again. He painted the block the same industrial green as the tractor's frame, a small act of defiance against the rust and decay he was fighting. By the time the first spring thaw began to soften the frozen ground, the rebuilt engine was sitting on a stand, gleaming under the single light bulb. The day he decided to fire it for the first time, Sarah came out to the shop, her hands clasped nervously. Jed had rigged up a temporary fuel line and hooked up a pair of heavy-duty batteries. He checked the oil one last time, then climbed onto a stool and hit the starter button. The starter motor groaned, the sound of immense strain. The massive engine turned over once, twice, a third time agonizingly slow. Jed held the button down, praying he hadn't missed something, that he hadn't just wasted their savings and an entire winter of his life. Then, a puff of white smoke coughed from the open exhaust manifold, followed by another. A chuffing sound, then a deep guttural bark. The engine caught. It stumbled for a moment, then roared to life, a thunderous, deafening explosion of noise that shook the very foundations of the old barn. The concrete floor vibrated under their feet. It wasn't a smooth, refined sound like Davy's new deer. It was the raw, untamed bellow of pure power, a mechanical beast awakened from a long slumber. Jed let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A slow grin spread across his face, cracking the grease on his cheeks. He looked at Sarah. Her hands were pressed over her ears, but her eyes were shining. In that moment, she didn't see a pile of junk. She saw what he saw. She saw hope. The years that followed were good ones for farmers. The early 1970s brought a wave of prosperity, the likes of which no one had ever seen. In 1972, a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been $1 a bushel, suddenly shot to $3. Soybeans doubled. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly worth $1,500, then $2,000. It was a gold rush, and the banks were handing out money like candy at a parade. For men like Rich Davies, it was a dream come true. He was the poster child for the new era of aggressive, leveraged farming. The soaring value of his land gave him immense collateral, and he used every penny of it. His new John Deere 4630 was soon joined by an even bigger International Harvester 1466, its turbocharged engine screaming as it tore through the fields. He traded his combine every 2 years, always having the latest, biggest model. He bought the 80 acres north of him, then the 120 to the east, all on credit. He built a new sprawling brick ranch house for his family, put in a swimming pool, and bought his wife a brand new Lincoln Continental. At the diner, he'd spread his loan papers out on the table, bragging about his line of credit. "The banker told me I'm his best customer," he'd say. "He told me, 'Rich, you're not farming acres, you're farming dollars.'" He and the other progressive farmers looked at Jed Stone with a kind of benevolent pity. Jed, meanwhile, was quietly, methodically putting his beast to work. The Steiger, which the neighbors had christened the Green Monster, was an ugly patchwork machine. Jed had fabricated a new cab for it out of sheet steel and plexiglass, functional but crude. The paint was a mix of the original faded green, the new paint on the engine, and patches of red oxide primer where he'd welded cracks in the frame. But the thing could pull. Lord, it could pull. Jed bought a massive 30-foot field cultivator and a 7-bottom plow at auction for pennies on the dollar because no one else had a tractor big enough to use them. While Davies was making 2 passes, Jed was making 1. He worked his land faster and more efficiently than ever before. The money was rolling in for him too. The high grain prices filled his bank account just like everyone else's. But his reaction was profoundly different. While Davies was buying new iron, Jed was reinforcing the old. He rebuilt the transmission on his 4020. He put new tires on the Steiger, a massive expense, but one he paid for with cash. He didn't build a new house, he put a new roof on the old one. He didn't buy a new car, he replaced the engine in his 10-year-old Ford pickup. A prime 40-acre parcel came up for sale on his western border. The owner had passed, and the kids wanted to sell quickly. Davies put in an offer, a high one, contingent on financing from the bank. Jed went to the family's lawyer with a cashier's check in his hand for a slightly lower amount. It was every penny of his savings from the last 2 harvests. The family, needing the cash immediately, took Jed's offer. Davies was furious, complaining to anyone who would listen that Stone had stolen his land. But the old-timers at the co-op nodded with grudging respect. Cash was still king. Jed was now farming more land than ever, and he owned every square inch of it. He had no equipment loans, no operating notes. His only debt was the last few $1,000s on the original mortgage on his father's homestead, which he was paying off in aggressive chunks. To the outside world, he looked like he was falling behind. His equipment was old and ugly. His house was modest. He still wore patched overalls. Davies and his crowd saw him as a man afraid of progress, a relic who was missing the opportunity of a lifetime. They didn't understand that Jed wasn't building an empire of assets, he was building an empire of independence. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jed was at the grain elevator, waiting in line to unload his corn. Rich Davies pulled up alongside him in his gleaming new Peterbilt grain truck, a purchase Jed knew had cost more than his own house. "Still running that old junk, I see," Davies yelled over the rumble of their engines, gesturing toward Jed's battered 10-wheeler. "She gets the job done," Jed replied evenly. "You know, Jed, it's not too late," Davies said, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone. "The banker over at Farmers Trust, he loves me. I could put in a good word for you. Get you a real line of credit. You could trade in that whole museum collection of yours and get some new paint. Start farming like it's 1978, not 1948. Jed just looked at him. He saw a man standing on a platform built of debt, waving a flag of prosperity, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was beginning to shake. Jed had been listening to the news on the radio in his shop late at night. He'd heard the reports from Washington about fighting inflation. He'd read in the Farm Journal about something called variable interest rates. "I appreciate the offer, Rich," Jed said, turning his attention back to the unloading auger. "But I'm happy with what I've got." Davies just shook his head and drove off, the chrome on his new truck flashing in the sun. That evening, as Jed sat at his kitchen table paying his bills, a small news item on the radio caught his ear. The Federal Reserve, in a move to curb runaway inflation, had raised the prime interest rate. It was a substantial jump. The announcer mentioned that economists were predicting more hikes to come. Sarah was washing dishes, her back to him. "Did you hear that?" Jed asked quietly. "Hear what, dear?" "The interest rates," he said. "They're going up." A cold knot formed in the pit of Jed's stomach. He looked out the window, across his fields, dark and resting under the harvest moon. He thought of Rich Davies and his massive loans. He thought of the bankers, so eager to hand out money. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the good times were over. The party was ending, and the bill was about to come due.